The universe had always been quiet. At least, that is what most people believed. Out there, between the stars, nothing ever answered back. For decades, scientists pointed their equipment at the sky and heard nothing but the soft hiss of empty space. But on a cold Tuesday night in November, that silence finally broke. Dr. Leon Hart was asleep in his small house in Tucson, Arizona, when his phone started ringing. He was 61 years old, retired, and had not expected to hear from anyone at NASA ever again. He had left the space program 4 years earlier after 30 years of service. He had done his part, he told himself. Let someone younger carry the weight now. But the voice on the other end of the phone was not offering him a choice. It was Calvin Rue, a signals analyst he had trained years ago. Calvin's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something tight. He said, "We picked up something tonight, something we cannot explain, and he needed Leon to come in right away." Leon arrived at the Lunar Monitoring Station's data center in the early hours of the morning. The room was bright and quiet, filled with screens. Calvin was sitting at his workstation, eyes red from staring at data for hours. A few other analysts stood nearby, speaking in low voices. Nobody looked like they had slept. The signal was unlike anything in the catalog. It was not a pulsar, not a gamma burst, not radio noise from a dying star. It was structured, repeating, layered with patterns that did not occur in nature. Leon sat down and studied it for 6 hours without a break. He drank 4 cups of coffee. He said nothing for most of that time. When he finally looked up, his face was calm, but his hands were not. He told Calvin quietly that what they were looking at was a mobilization order. Something was moving. A large group of somethings. And they were all receiving the same instruction at the same time. The room went still. Captain Dana Voss arrived by early afternoon. She was the commander of Space Defense Command's Northern Sector, a tall woman with short brown hair and the kind of steady focus that made people stand up straighter when she walked into a room. She had been briefed on the way over. Now she stood behind Leon and read the data herself, line by line, without saying a word. It took the team another 18 hours to triangulate the source. The origin point was a star system roughly 400 light-years away. That was the good news. The bad news was that the fleet, because that is what they were now calling it, was already moving. It had been moving for some time. And based on the direction of travel, it was aimed directly at Earth. Estimated time of arrival, 14 months. Dana called an emergency session with the Joint Chiefs and a closed meeting of the UN Security Council. The information did not leave those rooms. There was no public announcement. The world woke up the next morning and had no idea that everything had changed overnight. A task force was assembled quietly that same evening. It was given the name Iron Veil. Dana was put in command. Leon was brought back on full contract. Calvin was reassigned permanently. 40 other specialists, engineers, physicists, tacticians, and linguists were pulled from their regular posts and given new ones. On the last night before the task force officially began its work, Leon stayed behind after the briefing. The building was nearly empty. Dana was still at her desk, reading through documents on a tablet. He stopped at the door and turned back to look at her. He said, simply and without drama, that they were not coming to talk. Dana did not look up from her reading. She just nodded once, slowly, and kept working. Outside, Tucson was dark and quiet. The stars looked exactly the same as they always had. But nothing, from that night forward, would ever be the same again. Iron Veil moved fast. Within 48 hours of its formation, the task force had taken over a secure facility beneath Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado. The offices were plain and cold. The halls smelled like recycled air and old coffee. Nobody complained. There was no time for it. Nina Caldwell drove up from Houston with 2 suitcases and a hard drive full of propulsion research she had been sitting on for 3 years. She was 38 years old, an aerospace engineer who had spent the last decade designing experimental drive systems that most people said were too risky to ever fly. She had a quiet voice and a sharp mind, and she wasted very little time on words that did not matter. She walked into her first Iron Veil briefing, sat down at the long table, and listened to the full threat assessment before she raised her hand. She told the room that waiting for the fleet to arrive was not a strategy. It was a prayer. And she did not think prayers were going to be enough this time. Admiral George Farr, sitting at the head of the table with the expression of a man who had not slept in 2 days, asked her what she was proposing instead. Nina said she wanted to send probes out ahead to meet the fleet. Not weapon platforms. Not fighters. Just observers. Small, fast, unmanned vessels using her experimental drive to cross the distance in weeks instead of years. They would carry sensors, recorders, and a powerful transmission array. Their only job was to get close, see what they were dealing with, and send everything back. Farr pushed back immediately. Resources were already stretched thin. Every piece of hardware and every engineer had been assigned a job. Pulling materials for an untested experimental launch was a risk they could not afford. The argument went around the table for 2 full hours. Dana Voss listened without saying a word. When everyone had spoken, she called for a vote. Nina's proposal passed by a single vote. Within 3 weeks, 4 unmanned probe vessels were being assembled in a sealed hangar. Nina barely slept during that period. She moved between the hangar floor and her desk, checking tolerances, reviewing software, sending corrections back to the engineering teams at all hours. Leon visited her one evening and found her eating a cold sandwich while reading a drive calibration report. He asked if she was all right. She said she would be once the probes were in the air. They launched on a Thursday, one after another, with no ceremony. There was no crowd watching. The sky above Colorado was gray and heavy. The 4 vessels climbed through the clouds and were gone. While the probes traveled outward, Leon kept working on the original signal. He had been decoding it layer by layer for weeks. What he found buried deep inside the signal made him sit at his desk for a long time before he told anyone else. Embedded within the transmission, like trophies collected over centuries, were fragments of other signals. Radio waves from other worlds. Distress calls. Final broadcasts. The kinds of sounds a civilization makes when it knows it is running out of time. There were at least 9 of them, maybe more. All of them old. All of them silent now. Leon brought the finding to Dana that evening. He explained it quietly and without drama, the way he explained most things. She listened to all of it before she said a word. Then she asked him how many of those civilizations had survived. He shook his head slowly. None of them, as far as he could tell. She looked at the dark window for a moment, then turned back to her desk and kept working. 3 weeks later, someone leaked the story. Not the full picture, but enough. News programs ran it overnight. Social media exploded. By morning there were crowds in the streets of a dozen cities. Dana gave a public address from a plane room with no podium and no notes. She told the world the truth. She said something was heading toward Earth and that the people working on it were among the best humanity had ever produced. And she said the thing that had always made human beings different from everything else in the known universe was not their speed or their weapons. It was that when something came for them, they did not fold. They got to work. The crowds did not disappear. But the tone changed. Something in her words had reached people in a way that statistics and threat assessments never could. Far out in the cold dark, the 4 probes were still moving. And somewhere ahead of them, just beyond the reach of any telescope, the fleet kept coming. The first probe images arrived on a Saturday morning, 14 weeks after launch. Calvin was the one who saw them first. He had been monitoring the feed alone in the dark when the data began streaming in. He stared at his screen for almost a full minute without moving. Then he picked up his radio and called Dana. By the time she arrived, the full picture had assembled itself across 3 large display screens. Nobody said anything for a long time. The alien fleet was enormous. Over 4,000 vessels, stretching across a region of space so wide it took special scaling to fit the image on a single screen. The ships came in all sizes, from small fast escorts no bigger than a commercial jet to massive capital ships that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. In the center of the formation, dark and slow and almost too large to process, were 6 Planet Cracker-class warships. Leon had named that category himself. He was not trying to be dramatic. It was simply the most accurate description. The alien species was given an internal code name, the Vorkai. Nobody knew what they called themselves. The name came from an early signal pattern Calvin had identified weeks before, and it had simply stuck. What the imagery showed was a civilization built entirely around efficiency. Every ship had a role. Every ship held its position. The formation was perfect, completely symmetrical, with no gaps and no disorder. It was the kind of precision that came not from discipline alone but from deep design. These were not soldiers trained to hold a line. These were a people for whom the line was the only way they knew how to exist. Leon studied the footage for 2 days straight. On the third morning, he walked into Dana's office and sat down across from her desk. He said the fleet was impressive. No question about that. But he had noticed something. The formation never changed. Not once across all the hours of footage had any ship shifted position unnecessarily. They were moving in a fixed pattern toward a fixed point, exactly as they had probably done many times before. He told her they were efficient, but not adaptive. There was a difference between those two things. Dana put down her pen and looked at him. He explained that adaptive things survive surprises. Efficient things, when hit by something they did not expect, tend to shatter. Meanwhile, Nina and her engineering team had been quietly building something they called the Rail Network. It had no official project name, no public record, no file number. 12 deep space platforms positioned within the asteroid belt, each one disguised as a standard mining operation. What they actually were was something no enemy would expect from a civilization that had never sent a warship beyond its own solar system. Each platform held a series of electromagnetic rail accelerators capable of launching dense tungsten projectiles at a fraction of the speed of light. No energy signature. No beam. No guidance system that could be tracked or jammed. Just mass, moving very fast, across an enormous distance. Nina explained it to Far using a simple image. She said to imagine walking down a street and a rock strikes you from 3 blocks away. You never saw it leave anyone's hand. You never heard it coming. That is what the rail network does. Far had looked at her for a moment, then said simply, "Good." Calvin had also made progress cracking the Vorkai communication protocol. Not enough to translate their language, but enough to track fleet orders and movement signals. Humanity could now listen to them, even without fully understanding every word. Then one of the probes captured something that changed the atmosphere inside the facility entirely. A single Vorkai vessel had broken away from the main formation, moved toward a small unrelated ship that had crossed its path, and destroyed it in less than 4 seconds. No communication first. No warning shot. No pause. The smaller ship had simply been in the way, and so it ceased to exist. The footage played on the main screen 3 times. Nobody asked for it to be replayed. It just kept running on the loop. Dana watched all 3 plays with her arms folded. Her face was very still. Then she turned away from the screen and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried across the whole room. She said she was not going to let them get within 1,000,000 miles of home. Nobody disagreed. Nobody doubted her. The room simply went back to work. 9 months remained. The plan was taking shape. All it needed was perfect timing, and the ability of thousands of human beings to do everything right, once, with no room for error. Humanity had done harder things. At least that is what it told itself in the long hours before dawn, when the screens were bright and the stars outside were very, very quiet. The plan had a name, the Anvil. It had 3 stages, and every single one of them had to work. Commander Pete Solis had designed the tactical framework over the course of 6 weeks, barely leaving the operations room except to sleep for a few hours on a cot in the corner. He was a lean man from Baltimore with a background in orbital combat theory, a field that had until recently been entirely hypothetical. Now it was the most important job on the planet. Stage 1 was patience. The Vorkai fleet would be allowed to enter the outer solar system, crossing past Neptune's orbit before any response was triggered. Letting them come that far was the hardest part for everyone to accept, especially Far. But Pete had run the numbers. Striking too early meant the fleet had room to scatter and regroup. They needed the formation tight, focused, committed. Stage 2 was the rail network. All 12 platforms firing in sequence, timed across a window of less than 90 seconds. The first volley would travel over 800 million miles before it hit anything. At the speed the projectiles would be moving, that journey would take just over an hour. An hour during which the Vorkai would have no idea anything was coming. Stage 3 was the Interceptor Swarm. 40,000 autonomous drones, each roughly the size of a large appliance, released into the chaos after the initial strike. They were not designed to destroy. They were designed to disable engines, communication arrays, navigation systems. The goal was not to kill the fleet. It was to stop it. Pete ran 10,000 simulations. The results were not comfortable reading. In 68% of the scenarios, humanity came through. In the other 32%, it did not. Farr called 68% acceptable. Dana said it was not. She sent Pete back to refine the timing on the interceptor release and told Nina to squeeze another 3% out of the drone targeting accuracy. 2 weeks later, Pete ran the simulations again. The survival rate climbed to 74%. Dana said, "Keep going." They got it to 79% before the calendar ran out. As the Vorkai fleet approached the outer boundary of the solar system, Calvin's monitoring confirmed what the probe footage had suggested. They were scanning. Methodically, carefully, in long sweeping arcs, probing for energy signatures and communication signals. They had done this before and they knew what hidden defenses looked like. Iron Veil went completely dark. All 12 rail platforms powered down. Every antenna went silent. The drone swarm sat cold and unresponsive in the asteroid belt. Earth itself reduced its outward-facing transmissions to the minimum needed to keep the civilian grid alive. For 72 hours, the solar system held its breath. The Vorkai fleet paused at the edge. Their scans swept back and forth. The formation tightened slightly, which Calvin flagged as a possible defensive posture. Everyone in the operations room watched the data feeds in silence. Then the fleet moved. They had found nothing. Whatever their sensors were built to detect, humanity's quiet had been quiet enough. The Vorkai resumed their approach, the formation locking back into its familiar perfect shape, every ship returning to its assigned position. They were committed now. Nina initiated the rail platforms from her station in Colorado. The sequence was automatic once triggered, but she sat there and watched every step of it, her hands flat on the desk in front of her. 12 platforms. Staggered timing. Tungsten projectiles crossing 800 million miles of empty space. 1 hour and 4 minutes after firing, the first volley struck the Vorkai command formation. There was no flash, no visible explosion from a distance. The sensor data just changed. 14 Vorkai capital ships disappeared from the tracking feed in the space of 11 seconds. The formation broke. It happened exactly as Leon had predicted. Without the command ships to coordinate the response, the rigid structure that had made the fleet so impressive became its greatest weakness. Ships that had been designed to hold position had no instructions for what to do when the position no longer existed. They began to drift. Some accelerated. Some slowed. The perfect symmetry dissolved into something that looked, for the first time, like confusion. The interceptor swarm released on schedule. 40,000 drones spread outward through the fractured fleet, moving fast and quiet, targeting the systems Pete had identified as critical. Engines went cold. Antennae went dark. Navigation locks lost their fix. Pete watched the tactical display from his station. His face showed nothing. But his hand, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, was perfectly still. Then something no one had planned for happened. The Vorkai stopped firing back. Instead, a single powerful transmission burst out from the remains of the command formation, aimed directly at Earth. It was not a weapon. It was a message. The first communication the Vorkai had ever sent to any species they had targeted. They were trying to talk. The transmission reached Leon and Dr. Priya Osei within minutes. Priya was a xenolinguist from Yale who had spent 8 months inside Iron Veil building translation frameworks from the signal fragments Leon had decoded. She was calm under pressure in the way only people who have spent years preparing for one specific impossible moment can be. She and Leon spent 4 hours going through the message. The Vorkai wanted to know what weapon humanity had used. They had seen kinetic strikes before, but nothing at this speed and scale. It came from a direction they had not watched, in a form they had not prepared for, from a civilization they had dismissed as primitive and no threat. That last part, Leon noted quietly, probably stung. Priya went deeper than the literal words. She told Dana the tone was unlike anything the signal record had shown before. It was not a threat or a demand. The Vorkai were confused, disoriented, and underneath all of that, she believed they were afraid. Dana stood at the window for a long moment. Then she said, "Good. Let them be." The debate about how to respond lasted 6 hours. Far wanted silence. Let the Vorkai sit with their damaged ships in the cold dark and wonder what else was waiting. Pete agreed, arguing any response gave information away. Nina wanted to fire a second rail volley first so whatever message they sent arrived alongside a fresh demonstration. Dana listened to all of it. Then she turned to Priya and asked what she thought the right answer was. Priya said that every species the Vorkai had encountered had either been destroyed or never got a chance to speak. This was the first time in that long brutal history that the Vorkai had asked a question of someone they came to take. That had never happened before. She said the right answer was honesty. Dana wrote the response herself. It took 40 minutes. Priya translated it. The message was short. It said humanity had not chosen this conflict and had not asked to be selected. But it protected what belonged to it, and it was considerably better at that than the Vorkai had expected. The path home was open. The path forward was permanently closed. The transmission went out and Iron Veil waited. 11 hours passed. The interceptors continued their quiet work through the fractured fleet, disabling engines and cutting communications. No further rail strikes were launched. Humanity had made its point. Now it waited to see what the Vorkai would do with it. Calvin was the first to notice the change on the tracking display. He said in a very even voice that some of the ships were turning. The room went still. It started with the most heavily damaged vessels at the edges of the formation. They turned slowly, like something reluctant finally accepting a truth it had been avoiding, and began moving back the way they had come. The escorts followed. Then the mid-range ships. The process took nearly 3 hours. The capital ships were the last to turn, and they did so without any visible command signal, as though each one reached the same conclusion on its own. The Vorkai fleet was going home. Leon watched from the lunar station, alone at his workstation in the quiet of early morning. He did not cheer. He sat and watched the tracking signatures pull away from Earth one by one until the display showed nothing but clean open space. Calvin asked from across the room if it was over. Leon said he thought so, for now. But the Vorkai would carry this story back with them through whatever networks and alliances they belonged to. The story of the small planet that stopped an armada with weapons no one had expected, from a direction no one had thought to watch, built by a civilization that was not supposed to be capable of it. Sometimes, Leon said, the most powerful force in the universe is not a weapon. It is the story that makes the next enemy stop and think before it begins. Earth was told the full truth the following morning. Not as a threat assessment. As history. Dana gave the final address from the same plane room she had used months before. She thanked no governments and no generals. She thanked the engineers who had worked long shifts for over a year without recognition. The analysts who had slept at their desks. The people who had stayed quiet when silence was needed and kept working when working was the only choice left. She said the stars had always been out there. They would always be out there. And humanity, for as long as it drew breath on this planet, would always be looking back. In Houston, Nina Caldwell sat on the roof of her apartment building with a cup of coffee, looking up at a clear night sky. The city hummed below her with ordinary noise. A world going about its life, not yet fully understanding how close things had come or how many quiet, tired hands had held everything together through the long months. She was not thinking about any of that. She was just looking at the stars the way she had since she was a child, with a simple feeling that they were worth looking at no matter what else was happening. Somewhere beyond Neptune, the last Vorkai ship crossed the outer edge of the solar system and slipped away into the dark. And Earth, for the first time in 14 months, exhaled.